Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Hello, and welcome to everyone joining us today on Read Smart, the official podcast for the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction. We're quickly approaching the winner announcement on November the 19th, and in the lead-up, we're speaking with all 6 shortlisted authors about their brilliant works. Today, we're joined by Richard Flanagan, who's been shortlisted for his book Question 7. As a multi-award-winning writer, Flanagan's works have garnered significant acclaim, and his storytelling prowess is widely recognised. The Narrow Road to the Deep North is particularly celebrated for its profound exploration of love and war, and won the Booker Prize in 2014. And Gould's Book of Fish, with its unique narrative style and historical depth, won the Commonwealth Prize in 2022. Starting as a love hotel by Japan's inland sea and ending by a Tasmanian river, Question 7 explores the choices we make and their ripple effects. From H.G. Wells and Rebecca West's affair, through 1930s nuclear physics, to Flanagan's father as a prisoner of war in Japan and the catastrophic atomic bomb in Hiroshima, Flanagan follows this chain of events until they culminate in his own near-death experience. A young man trapped in a wild river's rapid, unsure of his fate. Through a hypnotic blend of dream, history, science and memory, he reveals how our lives often spring from the stories of others and the narratives we create about ourselves, and asks readers to ruminate on one important question: who loves longer? Welcome, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Georgina. It's lovely to be here.
Now, you're somebody who's been recognised so widely in the world of literary fiction. How does it feel being shortlisted now for a non-fiction prize?
I never really quite know why writers want to be understood. I think it's misunderstandings that make us, Georgina. So I'm delighted to be shortlisted for a non-fiction prize, and particularly one as prestigious as the Baillie Gifford. That's a great honour.
I'm wondering how the idea of Question 7 evolved over time. What was the initial inspiration?
These are always the questions I struggle with most with a book. Books are written at once in a rush, and in another sense, they're a lifetime in their composition. And I think there were many things that had absorbed me for many years. What brought them to a head was, I think, that period coming out of COVID when, like many people, I began to wonder what it was to live. And you see this, in everything from the Great Resignation in the West to the lie flat movement in China. People questioning what it is, what life should be, how to live, why do we live, and really that leads to the questions of love and the darker subterranean forces that really shape us. And at the same time, I also saw that a world I'd grown up in, that I'd taken for granted, a material, physical world, was vanishing, that plants and animals and fishes that I had thought were there forever were disappearing all around me. And perhaps this feeling was stronger in someone like me who lives in a remote island, which happens to have the good fortune of having many species unlike any other in the world. But because of climate change and because of just simple human rapacity, suddenly species were disappearing all around me. Just yards from where I live is a bush park, where the last swift parrots can be found. There's less than 500 of these, the fastest parrot in the world, a beautiful little bird. They won't be around in another 10 years. A few bays round from where I live, there's this ancient handfish which actually walks along the sea floor on its front fins. There's about 80 of them left. They'll be lucky to last half a decade. And I think as each of these creatures go, we lose not just their uniqueness, but something extraordinary in which we all share and which makes us larger. And so I feel we're diminished by that. And with that diminishing of us, we also see an idea of ourselves vanishing, an idea of ideas of kindness and goodness and love. And I wanted to, thinking about all these things made me think more and more about my parents, both of whom, died some time ago. And the only way I had of holding on to them was through words. And I thought much about, particularly about my father, and the great irony of his life and indeed of mine is that I wouldn't be here talking to you if it wasn't for the fact of that terrible crime that was the atom bomb being dropped on Hiroshima in August 1945, and the 100,000 dead, and then a similar number killed a few days later with the second atom bomb on Nagasaki. And at that time, my father was a slave labourer in an undersea coal mine on the inland sea, about 80 miles south of Hiroshima. And he was near his end, and he was about to die. And it took the death of all those innocent people and that terrible crime against humanity for him to live and for me to be born and for us to be talking here today. And so I started thinking a lot about the atomic bomb, and I've thought about it and read about it deeply for many years. And what I discovered when, over much reading, was that although its stories presented to us as a series of scientific discoveries and political decisions and military imperatives, and that's all true, the atom bomb actually begins in a kiss in an Edwardian drawing room in London in 1913, and between Rebecca West, a young Rebecca West, and a middle-aged H.G. Wells. And it led H.G. Wells to write a novel in his flight from the love that Rebecca West was proposing to him. That was a novel of total destruction. And in it he invented a weapon, which he named the atomic bomb. And it is from that novel actually spurred a young Jewish Hungarian refugee in the 1930s called Leo Szilard to come up with the crucial and critical idea of the nuclear chain reaction. And without that, there wouldn't be an atomic bomb. And I then, the more I thought about this, I wanted to construct a book that was constructed like a chain reaction, that was a daisy chain of events that begins with a kiss and ends on a riverbank in Tasmania.
Let's talk about that riverbank, because you had a near-death experience on the Franklin River. It's a pivotal moment in the book. How did it impact on your perspective on life and writing?
Well, immeasurably. And being immeasurable, I can't enumerate it or recount it here. But all I could do finally was to revisit the experience and write about it in the way I did in this book. And I think what was interesting in writing this book is that it made me think about a lot about the fallibility of memory. But when I revisited this memory, the one thing I can tell you is that everything was utterly real and still happening. And it was like doing a journalism of some catastrophe or disaster. And each day I would go down this deep dark shaft to this place where I was once more that young man in this terrible place. And I would report a little bit more of what I saw. And then after a certain time, it would become intolerable and I would claw my way back out until the next day when I had to return. And those memories were as real and concrete, as the chair I'm sitting on now.
Although memory can be unreliable, but the whole book, you're exploring the boundaries there between truth and fiction. How do you navigate that, the unreliability of memory and the language in your storytelling?
I'm very clear when I'm dealing with something factual as to what is fact and what is imagined. And I think that's important in a book like this. So all the facts are verifiable. There was a mass extermination of a race of people on my island of Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, as it was called. It came to be seen as a genocide, a much disputed word today, but it was Raphael Lemkin, the man, the great Polish jurist who originated the very word and concept of genocide, who described what happened to the Tasmanian Aborigines as a genocide. And those things I try to, I deal in what is known, but I also deal in the soul histories that ensue, the strange subterranean ways in which these things continue to reverberate. And I guess what I'm particularly interested in is, in this book, is a notion of time where time is not linear in the European sense, in the sense that's proposed by the great European tradition of history. I talk in the book about an indigenous fourth tense. The Yolngu people in far northern Australia actually have this tense. So we have past, present and future, and then they have this tense which encompasses the past, the present and future. So if something happens to me today, it's also happening 1,000 years ago and will happen 1,000 years in the future. And I think that's truer to our reality. It also is a different way of conceiving of the universe, because if something that is happening today also happened 1,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, we have to conceive of our relationship to the earth differently, and our relationship to those who came before us differently, and those who come after us, if it is to happen again. We have to think much more deeply about what we do and how we do it. And this sense has always been strong in me. It was strong in the culture I grew up in, but I didn't understand it and recognize it, and wasn't really able to name it until I read this extraordinary essay by a young Yolngu woman, Sienna Stubbs, in which she talks about this tense. And so the book, in a sense, is written in a fourth tense. It's about how things that happened long ago, whether they're just simply personal, like my own story, or whether they are events of profound global consequence, like the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. It is that the bomb was dropped in August 1945, but in a sense the bomb is still being dropped. We still haven't come to terms with it. That's why we've got Russia renascent in all its horror in Ukraine. That's why we have what we have happening in Gaza, because of the shadow of the bomb hangs over all these countries. And so I was interested in thinking about both personal histories and larger global histories as something that is constantly with us, and we have to confront them if we're to find a path to some sort of personal freedom and some greater freedom.
When you talk about those larger global events, I mean, obviously, as you were saying, you include historical figures in the book. I wonder how you found your connection to them. Not only people like H.G. Wells, but all the Indigenous people in Australia that you write about so beautifully.
I guess it's not a question of striving. It is a question of, if you look carefully, you discover that you're not separate of so many other things, but rather that there are threads that bind us all. And it's seeking to honour those threads. And I find a certain joy in discovering what we share. It's the work of clowns and charlatans and fools to find what divides, finding what we share. That's harder work, but it's to me much more joyous and ultimately, I hope, more profitable for us all.
Richard, I wondered if you could discuss the significance of question 7, who loves longer, but in the context of your life as laid out in this book.
The title question 7 comes from one of Chekhov's earliest stories that he wrote when he was a struggling student, and he wrote comic sketches to make money. And the story's actually just several of those mental arithmetic questions that you get asked at school, if, a baker bakes 10 cakes by 10 o'clock and then gets an order for 7 at such and such and that. It's that sort of thing. And in his list of 12 questions, question 7 reads something like 18th of April, 1882, a train has to leave station A at 3 a.m. and arrive at station B at 11 p.m. Who loves longer, a man or a woman? That's the story. And it's just an absurdist joke. And yet contained within it is all the genius of Chekhov. So that he presents a surface world of timetables and a sort of reality that we all march to and accord with. And then he does this amazing turnabout. And he asks us, who loves longer, a man or a woman? And of course, there is no answer to that. And the answer isn't important. The point is that it is these currents beneath the so-called real world that are actually a true reality, that world of who loves longer, why do we love, how to love, and above all, I think, how to live. I think that's really the question that consumes us all. Why do we keep on living? How to live a life that has meaning, how to find, I think there comes a time in everybody's life where they realise that they live in a meaningless universe, in a pitiless universe. And the question is, how do you go on in that? And in all that, I thought a lot about my parents who asserted through their small acts of kindness and goodness, their stories, their laughter, and an idea of love. And over decades, they fought for that idea of love and they practiced that idea of love. And in the end, that love became their hard-earned reality. And what I thought was an illusion became a truth. And they were people who came from poor backgrounds and they knew exactly what the world was. But I, for a long time, when I was a younger, more foolish man even than I am today, I once thought them naive. And looking back now, I can see the naivety was mine alone. It was a form of magic, and they, the magicians.
Richard, finally, I want to ask you what you hope readers take away from question 7, but I wonder if that even was a concern for you, or if this just felt like a book you needed to write, and what we, as the consumers of that product, take away is not that important.
I think you just have to be true to your own soul when you write. If you, I don't know myself, Georgina, so it's difficult enough to write something for me, and I think it's sort of immense vanity to think what any other person would like. But what I have learned is that over many books is that the more you trust the reader, the less you say and the more you trust to the story you're writing, the more the reader will discover in it, not you, but themselves, their life, their history, their soul. And when they discover that, there's that beautiful act of communion that's reading, and the book comes alive. And I don't expect people to take anything from this book. But what has delighted me is that many people have contacted me and they've taken much from it. And it's always different. I got a letter from a reader in China, and his mother, who grew up in rural poverty in China, was much like my mother. Now, he knew and I knew that's not true in one sense. There could be so little similarity between those lives. And yet at the level of question 7, at the level of who loves longer, it was completely true. And at that moment when I read that lovely email, I thought it was worth the struggle to write this book.
Richard, thank you so much. That was just glorious. Thank you. We'd also like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its continued generous support of this podcast. The winner will be announced on Tuesday, the 19th of November, at an awards ceremony generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation. The announcement will also be live streamed across the Baillie Gifford Prize for non-fiction social channels. And if you're interested in finding out more about the shortlisted books, you can visit our website or follow us on X, Facebook, Instagram and TikTok at BG Prize. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening. Until next time. Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize podcast. This podcast is generously sponsored by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.